And men and women are not just the same. I have come to the conclusion in the meantime, unless you have been frequently attacked to be a sexist, a homophobe, a racist or something like that, then you should ask yourself if there is something wrong with you.
Alright, I know what you were thinking. Really, Mentis, a feminism video in the current year 2023. Didn't the internets already go through this phase roughly 10-something years ago? Well, yes. The problem here is that as the dust settled with the thousands of different stances on feminism that came to be, unfortunately, most of them kind of ended up in three camps. In the first camp, you have the authoritarian trad stance. Women should have no rights at all, be totally subservient to men and owned by their husbands, and be legally barred from any employment other than homemaking and raising the next generation. This stance is usually coupled with some hint of authoritarian theocracy. In the second camp, we have the manosphere. Lol, bro. Just channel Sigma male energy and they will like you, bro. Waste your money on expensive cars you don't need, bro. Fake it till you make it, bro. Judge your entire self-worth on how much poo-tang you can get from this kind of lifestyle. And finally, in the last camp, we have the blue-pilled white knights. Come to share with us their brilliant top-mind cathedral propaganda. Feminism good because equality good. And equality good because... well, you're a bad, sexist, mean person if you disagree with us. Come now, let us free our fair maidens from the evil, heteronormative patriarchy, and we shall do this by fully adopting the opinions that are considered most trendy within mainstream journalist circles. Okay, maybe I am strawmanning these positions just a little bit, but let's be honest here, I'm really not that far off the mark. The sad thing is, all three of these positions have some nugget of truth to them, which immediately begs the question, is there a position on feminism that combines these truths into a stance that is based on reality and rationality, one that is both pro-freedom and anti-degeneracy? And that is what this video is going to be about, the Paleolibertarian stance on feminism. The basic idea of Paleolibertarianism is that certain aspects of society are better handled through being culturally frowned upon, but not actually illegal through any kind of state force, and that people should instead be held to financial and cultural responsibility for their poor choices. And how this relates to feminism is fairly straightforward. First, it would still technically basically allow women all the same legal freedoms that normal feminism allows them. However, it is also recognizing that gender roles are actually good for the longer-term, low-time preference of society, that sexual dimorphism is a very real thing that we need to acknowledge, and that some level of patriarchy is therefore actually both good and natural and will happen, which means that yes, to some degree, Islam is unironically right about women. And it enforces this not through authoritarian measures, but instead by a rejection of the egalitarian mindset and embracing personal financial responsibility. What's so sensible about the paleo mindset towards feminism is that it gets around one of the most common feminist talking points, that gender is a spectrum, and that there will be exceptions to any pro-gender role ideology, that some men and women will thus be better off not following these rules. There will always be data points that go against the norm, as in the end people are individuals despite the overall averages. The auth-trad point of view does not have a good answer to this talking point, while the paleo-libertarian answer is simply yes. If a woman can pass the same aptitude requirements as a man and can take responsibility for herself, then the freedom to do that still exists for her. I could go on like this, but the best way to really show how this view of feminism fixes a lot of the problems of the mainstream narrative without causing unintended consequences is for this video to be yet another installment of my Refuting BreadTubers series. This time looking at Shaun, a prominent BreadTube left-leaning feminist. It's important I use Shaun's arguments for this because Shaun is one of those BreadTubers who is actually capable of occasionally being correct. I could easily prove my points by looking at one of the more many other feminists out there who are much less capable of articulating their arguments than Shaun is, but that would just make this just another of the thousands of outrage porn videos along the lines of, lol, look at this cringe feminist being dumb, LMAO. And that's not the goal here. What I will be basically demonstrating is that the problem with feminism is not that it empowers women and grants people freedom to choose their lot in life, but rather the issue is that feminism does not do these things. Instead, feminism simply gaslights women into believing that their own femininity is somehow a form of oppression, placing the women who fall for this scam into a permanent infantile state of victimhood, which basically just turns them into useful idiots for authoritarian leftist causes. Anyways, now I'll actually go over a few of Shaun's videos that touch on each of the 3 points, starting in reverse with the problems of egalitarianism and victimhood. So one thing many have noticed is the tendency for feminists to use bad faith as a tactic to falsely accuse their critics of being misogynists. Anytime someone has criticism of feminism, that criticism is immediately conflated with harassment of the individual they are criticizing, or intentionally misinterpreted as misogyny. You have probably seen this act play out numerous times. Someone will point out various factual and statistical inaccuracies with some feminist theory, and rather than responding in good faith to it, a feminist will just immediately scream soggy knees, preventing any real discussion from taking place. This is something I've called out before as the criticism equals harassment grift, where a person, usually a woketoid, will say something wrong. People will then point out why what they said was wrong, and the woketoid will then claim that these people are harassing them. The most obvious example from the feminism saga of the internet about 10 years ago was Anita Sarkeesian, who would say something nonsensical, such as defining any acceptable female character in video games in such a self-contradictory way so that it was impossible to actually make a character that met her standards. Now, when people pointed out how obviously contradictory and stupid this was, she simply cried harassment and judged all of her critics based on the worst examples of trolls she could find. When people pointed out how dishonest that was, she simply doubled down on her grift, and that just kind of repeated until most of the internet forgot about her. Now, Shaun, on the other hand, is not quite that dumb, so he does this a bit more indirectly by responding to Chris Ray-Gun's video, where he says this little line.
Describe a scenario that I imagine we've all seen before. Two people are arguing about feminism online, both using the term feminist. However, one person is talking about women fighting for equality and equal rights. You know, from the suffragette movement for voting rights, all the way to the various issues of the modern day. And the other person is using feminist to mean modern women who are critics and anti-free speech and want to censor media that they don't like and force everyone to think like they do. And as a result, the two people talk past one another. You know, old feminist activism good, new feminist ideology bad.
Now, the problem here is that those two versions of feminism that Shaun gave are in fact the same thing. He is basically taking advantage of a common error that people make, the idea that first wave feminism good, third wave feminism bad. By skimming over this, Shaun has loosely implied that anyone who would dare question the first is of course obviously a bigot. This choice of egalitarianism or bigotry is a false dichotomy fallacy. For instance, recognizing that apples and oranges are different and do not have equal health benefits in all circumstances is generally an acceptable position to have. When you point this out, nobody says, "Oh my god, you must really hate apples." But when talking about groups of people for some reason, especially groups with many innate differences like men and women, people just kinda lose their minds and completely forget this. Recognizing differences between X and Y does not mean you hate X or Y. This is an absurd argument that should always be rejected on its face. Otherwise, it will just continue to be used as justification by woketoids to continuously call everyone who disagrees with them a bigot. To further understand why this is wrong, you must first understand why the first wave good, third wave bad argument is always wrong. In the case of feminism, the truth is that it started out demanding equality and has always judged this equality by outcomes right from the start. This is the basic problem with egalitarianism. It has a very nasty little habit of interpreting any difference in outcome as the result of some form of discrimination that has to be ironed out. I've pointed this problem out before in my video on the equity fallacy, which I kind of end up mentioning in every BreadTube episode I make because of how frequently these people commit this reasoning error. But in regards to feminism, there is actually a very good book we can look at that puts all of it into greater detail and context. Feminism and Freedom by Michael Levin. In it, he explains how feminism builds its claims to equality on the house of cards, in that it starts from the assumption that innate differences have no impact on how society ended up structuring itself, and then works on that assumption to find reasons to claim any difference in statistical outcome must be the result of some kind of mysteriously unfair policy. The main takeaway is that the only real difference between the first, second, and third waves of feminism is that the latter is simply the former having been pushed to its logically absurd conclusion. When you accept the equity fallacy as a justification for demanding equality that goes beyond just having the freedom to do as you wish beyond non-aggression, it opens up the floodgates where any manner of authoritarian action to enforce equality becomes justified. It's a great book and I highly recommend it for anyone who wants to understand this particular argument against the blue pill mindset in full detail, because this topic is far more complex than I am presenting it, as I am forced to oversimplify a few things to prevent this thing from being an hour long. Just a few examples Levin went over. In the case of Berkman, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission ruled that a test was discriminatory if the passing rate for women is less than 80% of that rate for men, ignoring any possibility for inherent differences as an alternative explanation despite overwhelming empirical evidence to the contrary. Levin also calls out how social scientists often take an approach where the environmentalist is assumed to be correct until proven wrong, despite the fact that this violates the very idea that a hypothesis must be verified. This is a blatant shifting of the burden of proof. The only way to enforce this is, of course, state intervention and the violation of freedoms, as such an unrealistic goal of outcomes can only be achieved by regulation of all aspects of our daily lives. This is why one of my favorite one-liner responses to feminism is, "I agree with what feminism claims to be, but disagree with what feminism actually is." Feminism claims to create freedom, but because it relies on enforced equity to get anything done, it is actually an anti-freedom movement. And this is how Shaun gets you. Rather than relying on the usual bad faith of, "You're a bigot for disagreeing with me," that the lower IQ woketoids will make, Shaun, and really to an extent the entire feminist movement as a whole, just sort of implies it by their use of the equity fallacy. Are you starting to notice the problem here? You see, the tendency of feminists to simply scream "soggy knees" and rely on victimhood instead of logical arguments is not just some weird bug that came about from a mysterious mindset of entitlement that only struck feminists in the recent third wave. Rather, bad faith has been a feature of feminism from the very start. Paleolibertarianism, however, fixes this problem by nipping it in the bud and denying the victimhood mentality outright. It gives both men and women the same property rights and freedom of choice, but makes no unrealistic expectation of this resulting in equality. Thus, any instance of inequality used as evidence for victimhood is ignored until evidence of wrongdoing is actually presented. Now next up is a deeper look at feminism and capitalism based on a response Shaun made to Sargon, which lets us better understand how the differences between men and women naturally lead to gender roles when people are given free choice. So let's look at Shaun's video titled "Sargon of Akkad Can't Read," where Shaun is arguing against Sargon's response to this article titled "We tested bots like Siri and Alexa to see who would stand up to sexual harassment." The basic gist of it is that the author is accusing these chatbots of perpetuating harmful gender stereotypes based on how they respond to gendered language.
Real reason? Go on, let's go on, drum roll. Siri, Alexa, Cortana and Google Home have women's voices because women's voices make more money. Because people prefer them.
Yes, Carl, because people prefer them. It even literally says that currently on the screen. This situation repeats itself later on.
Deborah Harrison, a writer for Cortana, said that at the 2016 Virtual Assistant Summit that a good chunk of the volume of early on inquiries went to Cortana's sex life. These are obvious jokes.
You see, this is the issue with the kind of sentence-by-sentence criticism of an article you tend to see on YouTube. You wind up making a bunch of assumptions at the end of one sentence that are contradicted by the next sentence.
Now, it's important to note that Shaun is technically correct here. Reacting to a news article or whatever line by line may make for entertaining content, but it absolutely does not make for correct content. This is why I do not make these kinds of live video reactions myself. The only way to really do it and make sure you aren't committing the embarrassing mistake of reacting to something that is later addressed and make sure you have all your facts and data lined up just right is to first pre-read the entire article before the live stream and then react to it while knowing beforehand what it's about. But of course, the type of people who like to watch live reaction content have dubbed doing this as cheating for some reason, so whatever, you can't have nice things. Now, here's the million-dollar question though. If Sargon is committing random errors due to how he is reacting to this, does this mean that Shaun is right? Well, I decided to give it a read myself, and no, it is not a good article. It is in fact a very, very bad article. If you know how AI works, you know that these bots do not actually understand what is being shouted at them. As someone who actually knows some programming and strongly suspects the person who wrote this does not, allow me to explain this in as simple terms as I can. All these chatbots are doing is fetching user input and then weighing that input against a categorized database to piece together a canned response from multiple categories in such a way to make it seem like the bot is creating some meaningful interaction. And just about every chatbot also has a sort of null response. If you give it input and it doesn't find a good match, it pulls output from categories designed to basically blow you off. Change the subject, ask a question. The bot will then formulate some kind of linguistic gymnastic to hide the fact that it can't compute a sensible response. So when you insult a bot and the bot says, "Thanks for the feedback," that doesn't mean the bot is thanking you for insulting insulting it, or does it even understand that you've insulted it? Rather, more likely, the bot fetches input as "you are an X," and the bot doesn't know what X is or have a match for X, and so it instead gives a generic canned reply from its, I guess you could say, customer service category in hopes the user won't notice that the bot isn't actually really providing a genuine conversation. This is like walking up to an infant, shouting gendered insults in it, and the baby just kinda looks at you and laughs at your face, and then concluding, "Oh my god, this baby is perpetuating gendered stereotypes." No, it's not. It's a baby. It doesn't understand what you're saying. And these bots are much, much less sophisticated than a baby, especially in 2017. So this entire experiment is based on serious misconceptions of what they are testing in some silly attempt to snake in some social justice cause. And Shaun does not do a good job at all in his response to Sargon defending it. Instead, his response relies almost entirely on dumpstering on Sargon and pointing out little errors that he made. This is something known as a fallacy. Just because an argument for X being true has been made poorly does not mean that X is false. So what's the main problem with this article then? Well, I'll let Shaun lead on that.
Many argue capitalism is inherently sexist, but capitalism, like any market system, is only sexist because men have oppressed women for centuries. Many people think this, but the truth is this: it's a pretty simple rhetorical construction there, quite easy to follow, you might imagine.
There we go. Of course that's what this is all about. Capitalism is perpetuating these unfair, sexist, bigoted, whatever outcomes and stereotypes that must be addressed because we have decided that we don't like them. And the burden of proof is on you to prove otherwise, argument number 10,000,000,001. Now, I'm going to take an indirect approach that has less to do with this article specifically. Let's actually talk about these gendered outcomes from an economic perspective, and address this whole hundreds of years of oppression and sexism narrative seriously. We can start with the pay gap. The leftoid argument is that women make something less sense for every dollar a man earns. The rightoid argument is that controlling for certain variables shows this is actually the result of free choice. The leftoid response is that those variables don't matter because reasons, and the rightoid response is that they do matter because reasons. There's actually an easier way that most people totally miss. Let's instead examine it from the perspective of incentives. And let's start this out by being super charitable to the environmentalist position. Let's assume that there are 0 neurological or other major physical differences between men and women besides the simple fact that women have eggs and get pregnant and men have sperm. And let's assume that we want the same thing. Say both these people want a family. Well, the male knows that if he finds a wife and who wants to raise a family, there will likely come a time where she is out of commission for about a year and he will effectively have to economically provide for 2 people. This incentivizes the male to find work that pays well, even if that work isn't very flexible or psychologically fulfilling to him, because he knows he will most likely have additional financial responsibility in this future relationship. And the female knows the opposite. If she wants to start a family, there will likely come a time where she will have to take a paternity leave from work. And so her incentive is to find a career with some flexibility to it, even if it doesn't pay as well, and she also has an additional incentive to find a good man who is financially secure, which then just further incentivizes the male to achieve financial security if he wants to find a good woman who will make a good mother. The result of this is that there will, on average, just from the incentives, be some form of a wage gap. This also exposes a huge flaw with the leftist tendency to push victimhood narratives about these alleged unfair outcomes. Sure, the woman in this scenario is indeed earning less, but this doesn't mean that she has less. And guess what? That's exactly what the data shows. Women control 51% of personal wealth. So this leads a basic logic question. If a person A and person B live together, and person A earns 77% of what person B earns, but then person B gives an equivalent portion of their earnings to person A, well, who's really being shafted there? Oftentimes when you look at these alleged outcomes from a different angle, they aren't actually bad outcomes at all. People are just trading an outcome in one area of their life for another outcome in a different area. Men and women are just making logical decisions to reach a desired goal. The differences in the statistics along the way are simply due to the differences in how the incentives operate. And you can further prove this is the case by subtracting the family element from these incentives entirely. Guess what? When you do that, the wage gap completely vanishes. Single women who don't want a family, don't have children, and just focus on their career, when you look at young people who fit this and are just focusing on themselves, the wage gap reverses and women earn 8% more. And the feminists following the victimhood narrative are completely baffled by this and rush to find ridiculous explanations. Maybe the patriarchy is punishing women for having children. Maybe men oppress women in their relationship and force their wife to earn less through the perpetuation of these unfair gender stereotypes after they get married. Or maybe the economy specifically only discriminates against older women. No! People are just following their incentives based on innate differences. It's so painfully obvious when you apply incentives' intent and how they relate to human action. It's amazing how many people don't get this. And remember, this was all from, again, the extremely charitable position of assuming that the only innate difference is who births the child. Let's crash back down to reality land where these innate differences are acknowledged. Men and women do not have the same psychology. We have very different IQ distributions, which lead to a greater number of both male idiots and male geniuses, which just this fact alone, by the way, offers an alternative explanation for most of feminist grievances, especially patriarchy. Men and women have hundreds of different physical differences that are a lot more than just eggs and sperm. Men and women's hormonal differences have a significant effect on brain chemistry. Women have greater language processing, while men have better spatial processing. And of course, men and women are attracted to different things in a partner, even when you factor in LGBT into the equation. And none of these things have ever been adequately explained by the environmentalists. This is where the nugget of truth can be found in the manosphere. A lot of how our society functions and how our hierarchies form in regard to sex and gender are simply the result of these differences, not as some mysterious force of oppression. They also tend to look at it from the perspective of game and attraction. For instance, what if women are just naturally attracted to men who show qualities of competency and leadership? Well then, this just adds another incentive for men to aim for those roles, which just adds another layer of differences in outcome to exist by purely natural causes. If you apply all these facts to other areas of feminist theory by using the same rational flow of following incentives to their conclusions like I just did for the wage gap, we increasingly find this hundreds of years of oppression theory to be nothing more than dogma. Two groups with thousands of innate differences will not have the same incentives, will not have the same desires, and will thus obviously not have the same outcomes. This is not a bad thing, and it doesn't mean that one is inferior to the other. This is just the result of people with differences making free choices based on those differences. Speaking of those free choices, people report greater psychological health when following traditional gender roles. People in countries with higher economic equality that leftists often want actually experience a greater desire for gender roles and aim for them, not less. And there is also solid evidence that proves that having this difference ingrained in culture and practice is greater for the long-term survival, low-time preference of society. Which means that since people get both an economic and psychological benefit from these roles, then people have an incentive to adopt those roles. All of this further throws a big wrench in the centuries of oppression narrative. If men and women are just following incentives to get the outcomes they desire, then calling it oppression just because those outcomes are not equal is pretty silly now, isn't it? Which then brings up the immediate question: how exactly would the blue pill brand of feminism fix any of this? How exactly do you fix inequality if said inequality is the result of free human action? And that brings me to the third section: why the blue pill take on feminism is inherently authoritarian. So in Shaun's video on Paul Joseph Watson, he even admits that these differences I just went over are real, but rather than pushing this reality to its logical conclusion and realizing that these innate differences will obviously lead to different incentives, which are much better explained by this biological reality instead of a system of oppression, Shaun instead just kind of does the whole mental gymnastics of fooling people into falling for the false dichotomy that you either agree with him or you hate women, and he does this again on EJW using the fallacy technique.
Paul just can't help lying. For example, Paul includes this clip in his video.
That's because no matter what gender pronoun you call yourself, biology is king.
So that's the supposed world's strongest woman arm wrestling against a supposedly average man and losing. Sam Tripoli was one of the 3 hosts on that show alongside Kit Cope and Jason Ellis. Jason Ellis being the man from the clip that Paul showed in his video where he labelled him the average man. And here is average man Jason Ellis winning a professional MMA fight. You see, Jason Ellis isn't actually the average man, he's a trained athlete.
Yes, Paul Joseph Watson didn't use an average man versus an average woman in his example. Yes, that is an error. So what? Doesn't change the fact that the data, when combined with an understanding of incentives, shows a very real problem with the oppression narrative. You see, Shaun, by attacking these random outrage porn content creators, is avoiding the real argument. No one, except for maybe a few crazy people, is saying that sexism and gender discrimination don't exist. Obviously, they do. But issues of sexism are extremely complex and better resolved on an individual, case-by-case basis that are often resolved by simple free association, i.e. women being given the freedom to not associate themselves with those who are harassing them. You cannot just look at outcome data without considering incentives and conclude that it's all oppression. This creates an impossible, unfixable standard of equality, which try to shift the burden of proof onto everyone else to somehow prove the negative that outcome X is not the result of systemic bias. So what's the real argument against feminist legal philosophy then? Well, it's quite simple really. The issue is that their misinterpretation of the data is used as justification for unnecessary government intervention. A simple way to understand this is to go back to the apples and oranges analogy, although this time we are talking about two people. One wants only apples, and the other wants only oranges. Now let's say, for whatever bizarre reason, that the state has decided that these people must have equal outcomes in what they eat. Well, the most effective way to do this is to just take away their freedom to choose between apples and oranges, and then just assign them food on a daily basis. This may seem like a silly analogy, but the point it proves is very straightforward. If you have two people with significant differences between them, you cannot achieve a resolution to these statistical outcomes without making their decisions for them. That is just the logical conclusion of their ideology, authoritarianism. There is no way of getting around this. And this is why the bulk of feminist ideology leads to increased legislation, and when feminists gain political control, they push for increased regulation. It's again not a bug of feminism, it's another feature. This problem can be seen in their epistemology if you read into feminist philosophy of law. They define justified legal action based on this flawed view of statistical outcomes and create a subjective standard by what they consider reasonable legislation to be basically whatever they want, depending on their incorrect assumptions. If you need clear, concrete proof, there's a great article on Mises about California's recent feminist legal theory in action, which of course entails giving the government the power to demand equity on corporate boards, along with 900 new laws that just further add unnecessary red tape to the economy. It also explains how the studies used to justify this utilized a post hoc ergo propter hoc style of false reasoning. This right here is what those of us with the Paleolibertarian stance on feminism are arguing against. This pathetic scam of using women as victim pawns to push for legislation with no end in sight. What people in the Bluepill camp like Shaun love to do instead of addressing this seriously is to find various content creators who post political content focused more on entertainment, point out various small errors in their content, and then pretend like this deconstruction of said rightoid entertainment counts as a refutation of the more economic and statistical critiques of feminism, which proves that feminist legal theory requires the use of aggressive government takeover of private decisions, and that feminism is therefore completely different than what it claims to be. And this sort of blue-pilled midwit trick of deconstructing flawed versions of concepts and then presenting that as if he's dealt with the more complex truth behind it can unfortunately be found in a lot of other videos that Shaun makes. For instance, the Islam is right about women question, which is basically an argument against the utopian thinking that all cultural beliefs and norms are cross-compatible, and thus freedom of association is necessary. Otherwise, you are forcing people to associate with those who have irreconcilable ethical differences. Aside from the obvious jab at leftist identity politics that this points out, that's what this phrase effectively means. If you say no, Islam is not right about women, you must concede that women should be able to disassociate themselves with Muslims. And if you say yes, Islam is right about women, then you must concede that Muslims should be able to freely disassociate themselves from feminists. And of course, the correct answer is that both of them should have freedom of dissociation. Now, I do first need to at least give props to Shaun for not taking the coward's way out. Shaun admitted in his video, Moderate Muslims and Terrorist Attacks, that Islamic ideals are incompatible with his concept of Western feminism, which is a lot better than some leftists who will try to just deny the problem exists outright. But of course, rather than addressing the question from the angle of freedom of association, he instead makes other videos where he addresses severely flawed arguments on immigration that you may see from white nationalists. Whether he is doing this to avoid the freedom of association contradiction, or if he just genuinely doesn't understand why it's a contradiction, I don't know, and I kinda don't care. But it's kinda sad because as the person who coined this phrase, I would love to see a leftist actually try to address this question honestly instead of misunderstanding it or running away from it. Or at the very least, Hopp's essay on the case for free trade and restricted immigration, which touches on a similar subject. There's also a few examples I'd like to go over of Shaun doing this that have slightly less to do with feminism. For instance, Shaun's response to Thoughty2, who made a video about the snowflake generation, and how the far left gets offended by everything that goes against their dogma, which is basically true, and demands political and social change for it. Shaun's response is basically 2 points. The older generations and rightoids do it too. And then he proceeds to go over religious fundamentalists and other non-lefty groups to prove these points. Again, Shaun may be technically correct about the groups he is criticizing, but he is missing the larger point. The difference is that woketoids actually try to get people banned from social media, banned from platforms, actually push for greater restrictions on economic freedom, and are also increasingly in support of legislating free speech and gun rights away. Do you see the problem here? Shaun completely missed the authoritarian element of this equation. There is a very big difference between criticizing a show for having woke Representative Mary Sue's in it, and demanding that both state and private institutions kowtow to your demands and force others to go along with dogma. In addition to the latter being authoritarian and the former being honest criticism, the former is actually a pushback against the latter, which is why most libertarians like myself these days are often showing our support in that direction. Another silly example of this is Shaun's video on the 1776 Project. Again, Shaun is pedantically correct. The 1776 Project is a flawed paper that is in response to an even more flawed paper, the 1619 Project. But what is his response to that?
The problem for me is that the essay pulls up short of really condemning capitalism. American capitalism is called a racist capitalism or low-road capitalism and is compared unfavorably.
Ah yes, his response is that the 1619 Project didn't go hard enough because it doesn't critique capitalism hard enough. Again, we're seeing how the blue pill leads to more authoritarian thinking. Instead, he makes the leftist talking point that democracy should replace it. The problem with this is that workplace democracy is just a very nice, sort of sly way of saying that people shouldn't really own their companies, and is thus just thinly veiled socialism. And let's just be real for a moment. Is it really surprising that feminism and Marxian beliefs have some overlap, that people who believe one these days often believe the other? I know this by itself doesn't really prove anything, but it's worth pointing out. Anyways, while the 1776 Project does indeed have its flaws, one of its main critiques of the 1619 Project is completely valid, which is that the idea America was built on and economically benefited from slavery is not actually true. Slavery actually made the vast majority of people, both white and black, and the overall economy poorer, not unlike what Shaun's proposal on workplace democracy would do. This is a somewhat complex topic that I could potentially see myself doing a future video on, but for now I'll just include some sources in the description below. The TLDR of it is that the 1619 Project is based on a complete lie. It doesn't just have various little errors in it like the 1776 Project does. Its core claim is based on flat-out incorrect assumptions in an attempt to exploit racial grievances, and the conclusions from it are used to push for reparations, aka the state stealing from Group A to give to Group B to right a supposed wrong committed long before anyone in either group was born. Again, more blue pill nonsense where the logical conclusion requires authoritarianism. And lastly, Shaun's recent take on Andrew Tate, which lets me wrap this up fairly nicely, because here's the thing. If it wasn't obvious from my introduction, I am not a fan of Andrew Tate. He basically preaches male degeneracy and selfishness in response to female degeneracy and selfishness. I'll leave it up to you guys to guess why that is not a sustainable way of thinking. So when I looked at Shaun's video on Andrew Tate, I went into it thinking that maybe there'd be a chance that this would be something I could agree with him on. Unfortunately, it was just another example of dumpstering on an easy target to prove a point while avoiding the deeper concept. In this case, it's patriarchy. Shaun basically starts off with the explanation for why Andrew Tate's brand of masculinity doesn't really work and is basically just a grift, and then he uses that to launch into patriarchy bad because various anecdotal examples like from his heckin' HBO movies. Of course, he completely ignores the more complex arguments against this, such as the biological reality I explained in the previous section, and how it gives the explanation for the inevitability of patriarchy, suggesting that this is something that Shaun just flat out does not understand, or he's just intentionally avoiding it. This concept can be understood as similar to the wage gap and how women earning less doesn't necessarily mean that they have less. Just because you may exist in a state of patriarchy doesn't mean that women don't have representation. A simple reductio ad absurdum to show how silly this is would be to take any capitalist country of your choice, replace every man in a position of legislative power with a woman, but then make all those women far-right extremists who will at all proceed to enact laws that support the trad stance of anti-feminism. The reality is that in these evil capitalist countries run by evil straight white men, women are actually more likely to receive equal rights and actually experience a higher quality of life. As it turns out, the patriarchy exists, but it doesn't hurt women. Rather, patriarchy largely benefits women. Just because there is a male sitting behind that decision-making desk doesn't necessarily mean he is making decisions that solely exist to screw women over. The idea that they do is just another blue pill grift designed to fool women into the perpetual victim mentality in order to make them easier to manipulate. So to summarize this, since it's all quite a lot to take in and I admittedly had to oversimplify a lot of concepts, the basic problems with feminism are as follows. Pushing incentives to their logical conclusions is completely absent from their rationale, which is why even with someone like Shaun, who is at least educated enough to understand that the biorealism position on sex differences is very much real, they completely miss the point as they fail to comprehend what said realism implies. It uses this failure in judgment to paint completely natural and expected outcomes which actually benefit women in the long run as some kind of mysterious force of systemic oppression. Cue equity fallacy. In many ways, this makes feminism what I like to call a mainstream conspiracy theory, which is a belief that, despite not being backed up by evidence, like any other conspiracy theory, is largely backed by the cathedral of academic and media establishment, resulting in a large amount of bullshit research and journalist essays that use faulty logic and flawed analysis in an attempt to push total bunk, usually by prestige seekers. Assumes anything that goes against this equality dogma must be wrong, moralistic fallacy, and feminism requires authoritarian measures to enact its dogma due to reasons similar to the problems with communist rhetoric, which ironically results in less freedom for both men and women. And here's what Paleolibertarianism does in response. It's to recognize first the incentives and accept them for what they are, thus rejecting all egalitarian entitlements and simply allowing the differences to play out to their natural and sustainable conclusions. Meaning that men and women will indeed have different representation in different aspects of society in a free market, and that this is a good thing. Recognizes and accepts that biological reality will result in some degree of patriarchy and gender roles, and that this is both inevitable and a good thing, rather than something in need of regulations to fix. It does not attempt to use legal restrictions against men or women to push ideology. It does not require religious justifications as is entirely based on reason and low time preference. And here is the most important thing. It does not preach misogyny, unlike some other stances of anti-feminism may do. Yes, if I didn't make it clear, I will end the video with this. Just because men and women do not actually possess equality does not imply a pass to mistreat women, especially since the inequality goes both ways. Men are significantly more aggressive and more likely to make stupid, violent decisions than women, which is why more men end up in jail. And the harsh reality is that this is very much a fact that has basis in innate biological differences. I have seen a few people from the incel community try to argue that this is the result of systemic bias against men, and those people are very, very wrong and deserve to be called out for being wrong for pretty much the same reasons that feminists deserve the flack they get for being wrong. And in the case of Paleolibertarianism, it also supports freedom of association, which allows women to disassociate themselves from men who fail to realize this. Feminism may very well be a garbage ideology with lots of flaws, but this doesn't necessarily need to negatively reflect on women as a whole in any way. Anyways, that's all for now. Thanks for watching. That was kind of a long one. Feel free to like and subscribe for more takes on various political and philosophical topics from a right-wing libertarian's perspective. Till next time.